we're now going to open it up for question and answer. And, we'll all show our faces and open up our videos. And, I'm going to moderate the questions and we'll relay them to the respective content expert accordingly. Okay, so we'll give it a couple seconds for questions to start coming in, and then I'll start channeling them to the respective expert. What are some strategies for managing glare from a highly reflective flat rooftop? What would you guys do if you got on site and you saw something like this? So Keith, if you want to go first, and then John, you can go second.
Sure. I'm a believer that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I always check the conditions on site beforehand. And if I can adjust, my timing to have an overcast day, that would be the first thing I would try to do. Although that's not always possible. So once you get on site, and if you notice there's a reflective roof, that might be a light colored roof, that might be a metal roof. Try it on auto if that doesn't work. Adjust your shutter speed, put an ND filter on. Both of those could work. A polarizing filter could also work to adjust that as well. But yeah, I would go through those steps. Absolutely.
Awesome. And John, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so it's always best to 3D map. So just echoing Keith here, it's always best to 3D map highly reflective roofing materials on an overcast day. If that can't happen, all right, then if either removing those images that have that reflection out of the batch of images before uploading, that's a great way to deal with those reflections, and also to adjusting the camera settings to tone down that whiteness, the brightness that's in the imagery there as well. ND filters also help. You maybe using one that's a bit subtle, because there's different filters you can use. So using a more subtle filter can help.
Awesome. And guys, I want to ask a follow-on question to this. So let's say you follow what you've suggested, right? You've adjusted your settings, maybe you've used an ND filter, and what happens next, right? You fly your drone, and what are some best practices to then address potential issues? Are you supposed to look at the flight controller and watch the pictures? Should you review them afterwards? Do you have to review them afterwards? Because you can do all the preparation you want and it still might not go accordingly. What are best practices once the drone is in the air, how you should take it over to finished product?
Yeah, you should
always do
always.
John this time, then Keith.
Yeah. So you should always, review those images, or watch the images in your camera viewport in the app as they're being taken. Sometimes the auto settings can adjust on the fly. So if you're keeping an eye on those images as they're being taken, then you can adjust those radial dials on your RC, right on the remote controller, in real time, and adjust the exposure and other camera settings that you have tied to those radial dials. You can quickly adjust on the fly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Keep an eye on it while you're flying, but it's also, it can be challenging. I mean, as a practical approach, it's challenging to look at your imagery sometimes and also fly the drone to make sure it doesn't hit something. So first of all, make sure your drone doesn't hit anything and do the flight first, and do your best to keep an eye on the imagery and adjust it when you can. But then, even if it looked good, always review it at the end. Bring your laptop on site and spend 5 minutes and just, thumb through the images real quick and make sure it's good.
Awesome. And I guess a final question on this specific topic, when you look at the overall workflow, do you guys ever adjust the images after they're taken? Doing whether it's digitally or you're back on the computer, you happen to get home and you didn't fully review everything. Did you ever see a situation where someone will adjust the images before they upload them to make a 3D model?
Yeah, it's not best practice to batch Photoshop those images. If all of the images have reflection issues and brightness contrast issues or white balance, if you batch Photoshop those images, sometimes that result, it's not going to be what you're looking for. Sometimes when you edit those images in Photoshop, they can be a bit more grainy, and you know, the resolution can be reduced, and the quality of the imagery can be reduced as you edit those images in Photoshop.
Great.
Yeah,
Keith,
second
anything
job.
to add to that? Okay, okay.
I mean, if you get into a jam, like, you know, you got to do what you got to do sometimes, but it's not a good practice. So don't do it if you can at all avoid it.
Great, good to know. Next question. We talked about ND filters. Someone asked about polarizing filters. Does anyone want to address what those are and when are they advisable to be used? Keith, maybe I'll direct this one to you first.
Yeah, so a polarizing filter can also be used to reduce glare. We use the term glare, or like I find people use the term glare a little bit synonymously. So like, to me, like, right, the definition of glare is sunlight that's reflecting off of a reflective surface, whether it's a metal roof or water, right? Those would be the two really reflective things, and a polarizing filter could also help for that. But a lot of people use the term reflective synonymously with overexposed and bright, and it's just important to pay attention to those two differences. So yeah, polarizing filter could help with reflective situations as well.
Awesome. Next question, is there any specific sources that you'd recommend for adjusting your drone or your photo settings? Any training materials, anything that is kind of a manual that will help you better understand the different settings and navigating which ones to turn on and off or up and down? Any recommendations, guys?
Yeah, so just searching through YouTube, there's some great tutorials out there. I think, just searching through YouTube is fine.
Agreed.
Any good resources? Okay.
Agreed that, and like in all seriousness, just get out and fly your drone a little bit, and just 5 minutes of messing around with the settings, hands-on, can take what you see on YouTube and really just help drive it home doing it in person.
Awesome. And if for anyone who's joined us, if you have a specific question about settings, you can also email us directly. We're happy to provide resources or helpful wherever we can. Okay. The next question I think is going to be particularly relevant for those people who fly in areas that are go in and out between sun and cloudiness, and also in and out between a drone flying in and around trees. So whether you're in Florida or Alberta or everywhere in between, I think this is actually going to be relevant. So I'll read the question here. So when there's a mix of sun and clouds, right, where the sun is full sun in 1 second, and the next second you've got clouds and it's kind of providing overcast or shade on the area, and it keeps changing back and forth. So right, that's the lighting difference that John talked about. Does that matter if some of the photos have one lighting versus another? How do you avoid it? It's very tricky at times when the drone's already in the air and all of a sudden you have a cloud that's come by. So how do you navigate that circumstance? What do you do during and after? Is there things you can do before? So Keith, why don't we start with you, and then John, I'd love to share your thoughts as well. How do you navigate those situations?
Sure. Auto settings can fix a lot of those issues, right? If you're going from bright sun to clouds, and your auto settings will adjust. So like under ideal circumstances, your auto settings should be doing all of this for you. But sometimes it doesn't happen. So, if you can, you can look up, and if you see one cloud in the sky, like, you can wait and kind of make your best guess. If it's really, really dramatic, you can pause your point of interest while you're in the air and hover for a few minutes and wait for the lighting to improve, or go back to normal and then keep going. So that's an option too.
Yeah, so the auto settings, should adjust for you as that lighting is changing. And if it's not, and you go back to the office, or you're in your truck and you're uploading those images, and you notice there's a pretty significant difference in lighting, right, in the images there, just remove those images from the batch, and that's fine. If it's not a significant change, it's pretty subtle, then just include those images, and the software will do its magic and disregard whatever it needs to disregard. So.
And John, on that note, we often get asked, should I remove these images? We say, yes, you should remove them. But what happens if there's like a certain chunk of the POI that you have to remove? Or should we be removing every other? How do we know when there are too many images that we've removed and we're going to affect the 3D model quality?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's when photogrammetry becomes in art more than a science. Now, and every photogrammetry engine, including Scanifly's, is like that. So, it just it's a matter of practicing and knowing what that threshold is and what the limits are. So yeah, it's hard to give a straight answer there. I apologize
no, that's
for that.
fine. That's fine. That's fine. I'll say, John and Keith are much more photogrammetry experts than I am, but in practice, what I've found is if you're removing a quarter to half of your POI, you're probably not going to get a good 3D model, and so you want to strike the right balance. If you're removing a small sliver, the remaining pictures should have coverage because your overlap, you want it to be roughly 80 to 90%. So you should have coverage. You also want to assess if that area is critical for the objective of your 3D model, right? For, designing solar, which is what you would do in Scanifly. John definitely hit it on the head in terms of that is where the art versus the science come in, but you also want to think about what the objective is for when you create the 3D model. And if you remove those pictures, how much that will affect that objective. Okay. We have a bit more of a technical question here focused on shutter speed. So I'm going to send this one to you, Keith. So when you recommend to lower our shutter speed, does it mean that you're going toward the quarter, 1/4, or does that mean you're going toward the 1/8000 end of the settings range? So if you could just clarify what direction you're going in when you're adjusting shutter speed, specifically when you're lowering it.
Sure. I should have caught myself when I was saying lowering. We should use shortening your shutter speed and lengthening your shutter speed. So shortening your shutter speed is making it a quicker flash of your shutter, and lengthening your shutter speed is having your shutter longer. So if you're shortening your shutter speed, you're bringing it closer to that 1/8000th because you're shortening the amount of time that the light is exposed to the sensor. And then having a long exposure, a lengthy shutter speed, can let more light in, but then you also, have the potential of running into a motion blur situation. So hope that helped clarify it.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. We have a high-level question that I'll tackle. What are the ideal altitudes and radiuses for a context and a detailed flight, and specifically when you're flying in a point of interest flight path? So for the context flight, we always say is you want to fly to the highest point of the site, whether it's the top of the tree or the roof, and then go above that by, let's say, 20, 30, 40 feet, 10, 20 meters or so, right? And so that is site dependent. For a typical residential property, you're looking 60 to 80 feet, unless you are in like the Pacific Northwest where you have 120-foot tall trees and your context flight will require you to fly at 150 feet, right? For detailed flights, you want to fly with the same idea in mind above the highest obstruction, but in that case, you're usually flying around the roof plane, and so you're going just right above the roof plane or right above that obstruction, okay? And I'll reference, we have on the Scanifly website, if you go to the resources tab under guidebook, there's a ton of content on, I think, 30 or 40 example sites and exact quantification of the parameters of how you want to fly and when you want to fly it, okay? We have another question here regarding Scanifly pricing. I'm going to not address that just because that is not as much in the spirit of what we want to accomplish on this webinar, but the individual asked that. I'm happy to talk separately about that question and we can get into that there. Do you normally, next question is, do you normally fly in orbit with the drone taking the photos automatically or manually taking the photos? And are there implications for how that would affect exposure and lighting? And so, John, I'm going to defer this one to you. Automatic POIs, manual POIs, what's the best way to get the best lighting that you're going for? I know we talked about this on our tree webinar that we did before, but let's think about it from the lighting perspective. What do you recommend?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I recommend adjusting your camera settings before even executing on that POI mission. right? So make sure that, you know, so once the drone is off the ground, you're hovering, you know, the camera is you know, you're looking and at the camera viewport to see what the lighting looks like, adjust those camera settings, and then execute on the POI mission. And, you know, whether it's a manual or if it's an automatic picture taking process, right? Those camera settings that you've adjusted prior are going to be used when you're taking the picture. So it's not going to really matter as much if it's manual or automatic. Just make sure you adjust those camera settings before you execute the POI.
Keith, I would love to get your thoughts on this as well, but I'd love for you to talk about it from the lens of when you first started flying drones. A lot of our customers start with us having never even flown a drone in their life. And ideally through our content and through their hard work, they get up to speed. So Keith, put yourself when you started flying drones into where you are now. I would love for you to address the question of automatic versus manual, using your hardware to the best of the ability, and then also for maximizing the best exposure. What do you think?
Sure. So I'm a believer in, you know, try auto first. Always do auto if you can. Well, I guess there's two sides to this question, right? Auto versus manual camera settings, which is try auto. And if auto doesn't work, like John said, you know, before you're even doing your POI, adjust your settings to get it where you need it to be. Then is the, you know, auto versus manual flight settings, right? A point of interest flight autonomously or a point of interest flight manually. An autonomous flight mode is going to make a way smoother path than a manual flight path. I mean, even if I try to do a point of interest manually, I mean, it would be a pretty good circle, but it wouldn't be as perfect as, you know, the DJI flight software does. So try to do that manually if you can. I'm sorry, correction. Let me try to do that autonomously if you can, unless you have like an extenuating circumstance, like a ton of trees or a ton of power lines, because it's more important not to crash your drone. The second side to that is you can manually take the images every 2 seconds, or you can set your camera on interval mode to take a photo every 2 seconds. I would recommend that you do the autonomous, have it take a photo every 2 seconds, because that, you know, increases the likelihood that you have the right overlap and is one less thing you have to be doing when you're flying. So regardless of whether you do a manual or an autonomous point of interest, always use that interval mode and take an image every 2 seconds.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith. Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. We've got another minute on the clock, but we have a couple more questions. So we're going to go a few minutes over for everyone's benefit, hopefully. The next question, I think this will be for you, Keith. It's about filters again. Can you stack filters is the question. So combining polarizing and an ND filter. And I guess when you answer that question, I'd love also if you can again kind of bifurcate what are the difference between polarized and an ND filter.
So an ND filter, it can be used for several purposes. Most commonly, it's used to meter the light coming through your camera to get the appropriate shutter speed in video, or to meter the light coming through when you're doing photography. And there's like a lot of nuanced reasons why you might use it. So there's that. A polarizing filter can be used to reduce glare after sunlight has reflected off of something and become polarized. As for stacking them, I don't know for all circumstances, but what I'm thinking about right now, most drones are outfitted with an ND filter or polarizing filter that literally screws on and doesn't have a way to kind of stack one on top of it. So I think that might be a hardware limitation and something that's, you know, could be invented that could be very helpful. So I don't think stacking them would even be practical or possible in most situations. So I'm thinking that's a no. Okay.
Awesome, Keith. Thank you.
No problem.
In the spirit of hardware, one follow-on question that we're seeing is, are there drones that you recommend are flown to maximize getting the best exposure possible, right? So how does a Mavic compare with a Phantom series or some of the larger, more expensive drones like the Inspire or the Matrice where you can add cameras to it? So I'm going to split this into two parts for you, Keith, keeping it complicated, right? Which drone would you recommend? And I guess also, are there certain cameras or add-ons that you recommend with drones where you can do that capability? So I'd love to get your thoughts on the kind of the drone hardware landscape for this topic.
Sure. I'm going to simplify this as much as I can. So if you're going to ask me the best drone for the application of the Scanify platform, given a ton of different factors, the capability of the drone, the availability of the hardware, the history of the availability of the hardware, I would say the Mavic 2 Pro is probably your best bet because it's got a 20 megapixel camera, which means that it's very, it's a high quality camera. It has high dynamic range, which means it's able to capture a large, a large range of colors in an image. And it is relatively affordable. It's, a fraction of the price of an Inspire or a Matrice or anything like that. So Mavic 2 Pro is typically what we recommend. You can make an argument that the Phantom 4 Pro might be better in certain situations, but the Phantom 4 was not manufactured for a while and then was manufactured again, which is typically why I don't recommend it, because DJI's, supply chain can be somewhat unpredictable. So blanket statement, I'd recommend the Mavic 2 Pro. The Inspire 2 does have options for better, cameras, higher quality cameras. The Matrice, same thing, as well as infrared, but I don't think that's necessary typically. So, if you can spend $2,000 all in on a drone setup versus 5, 6, 7, 10, 12,000 on a setup, I'd go with the more affordable option. So, yeah.
Perfect. And John, specific to Scanify, taking it one step further, in your knowledge of drones, does it matter, right? When you think about the variables of what it takes to create a good 3D model, does the camera landscape that Keith walked you through, how important is that vis-a-vis the other variables of getting drones right with the right angles and with the right coloring? And how do you see the drone type mattering for creating good 3D models on our platform?
Yeah, it's a great question. All the drones that are out there now, I think, have really good cameras. I personally have a really old Zenmuse X3 camera, right, and it still works. It's still just a great high quality camera, and it's really old now. So those cameras that are being mounted to the drones now are really high quality. And echoing Keith here, the Mavic 2 Pro, and that has a really great camera. I think they've enlarged the sensor on that camera for that specific drone, but they're good quality cameras. For me personally, choosing the best drone for site assessments is a high quality. The drone needs to have a high quality camera, but B, does the drone set up and break down quickly, right? The high quality camera is going to get you a high quality 3D model, right? So check that box. That's great. The other side of it is it very efficient? Is very what does the process look like for setting up and breaking down? That's not related to model quality at all, but that improves your user experience on site.
Great. One final question we have here, and I can address this one. In autonomous POI mode, what speed do you recommend taking your images? Typically, we recommend anywhere from 2 to 4 miles per hour. Obviously, if you're flying a much larger site, your context flight might go upwards of 5 miles per hour. But just certainly beware that you want to avoid flying too quickly and therefore creating a blurry image. Also beware of if you're flying at a certain speed and it's windy, you'll create a blurry image with vegetation shifting as well. And so just be cognizant of flying too quickly as it relates to the imageries that you're taking. So that wraps up our questions. I just want to, Keith or John, any final points to, we've got one more question that just came through, so I'll address it real quick. And then we'll, this gives John, you and Keith, you guys give a moment for final thoughts. But the last question is, with the Phantom 4 in its mechanical shutter mode, while the Mavic 2 Pro has an electronic shutter. So Keith, this one might already be pointing to you, but presumably this affects the quality of the overlying photos and the speed of creating the model and everything. So do you need to hover or capture, and what do you recommend? Well, with the Phantom, can you take photos continuously? So what's your perspective on kind of the comparison of these two drones and the two different shutter options?
I'm happy that this question came up because the way that I worded my last answer was very careful because this is the variable here, right? So the Phantom 4 Pro has a mechanical shutter. The Mavic 2 Pro has an electronic shutter, a global shutter versus a linear rolling shutter, right? So what that means is when the Phantom 4, or really any drone that has a mechanical shutter or camera with a mechanical shutter, it takes a capture of every pixel at the same time. An electronic shutter does it rolls across and takes the pixels in a different, not all at the same time. So there can be a slight variance, and that is why on the last one you can make the argument that the mechanical shutter could be better because of that situation. But given a few factors, one is that the flights that we're doing in the Scanify platform are done at a relatively low speed. That effect of the mechanical shutter versus the electronic shutter or electrical shutter is lower. And the other thing is, I mean, the Phantom 4 Pro, they didn't make batteries for it, and they didn't even make the Phantom 4 Pro for, you know, a while, going back a year. So there's always this balance between figuring out what the client wants and what the end client, like, right, the solar company needs. You know, do we recommend you buy a Phantom 4 that might not manufacture batteries starting tomorrow, or the Phantom that hasn't had any eruption in the supply chain? So there's always a balance there. But yes, that is the big difference between the two, and that's a debate between the two that you can have. But you can make the appropriate adjustments with the Mavic 2 Pro to get a deliverable that's within parameters.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that, Keith. If there's follow-on questions on that exact topic, we're happy to speak about that.
Happy to chat. That's a long conversation.
Cool. So John, any final thoughts? And then Keith, this will give you some time to think about your closing thoughts.
Yeah. So final thought, practice makes perfect. And, take the drone out and just have some fun, right? Experiment with those settings. Go through each and every camera setting and just experiment, see what it does in different lighting conditions. Even if you take the drone out for recreational use and you're not 3D mapping anything, you want to take a great picture of a sunset or for real estate, a real estate side gig or something, to just experiment with those settings to see what works and what doesn't in different lighting conditions and so on. It's a lot of fun, and just keep practicing, and it will be, you'll become an expert in no time.
Thanks, John. That's great feedback for the group. Practice makes perfect, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Keith, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to, resonate what John just said there. Practice a lot. The information we gave you here both can apply to photogrammetry, but it also can apply for using your drones to take marketing photos or, other reasons, right? So, you're grateful enough, you're lucky enough to have a drone that you use to create a model of the site that you're going to be installing solar on, but use that drone to take photos afterwards of the after product and, put it on Facebook and Instagram. And while you're doing that, practice using the camera settings and get familiar with it. And the more you do that, the better you'll get at this whole process. And eventually it'll just be, second nature.
Fantastic. All right, great, guys. So again, I guess the emphasis is on practicing. We know everyone's super busy with their schedules, but when you can get out there and find time to take pictures with different environmental conditions or different lighting, it's good to play around with those settings. We find that, and Keith mentioned this on the prior webinar, right? Your drone is really the tools, and the tools that allow you to drive your business. And so as much as you can get familiar with those tools, or we at Scanify or Keith at his company or Brian at HeatSpring can be helpful with that, please let us know. So if there's a question that we didn't address, or you have a follow-up thought or question, please reach out to us. We're happy to be a resource. Again, we want to thank HeatSpring for hosting our webinar and being our curriculum partner, and Keith for being our real expert on this topic on the hardware side, as well as Scanify's hardware partner. This is being recorded, and we're going to have it on both Scanify's YouTube channel and HeatSpring's library, so you can always look back at it. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to any of us. We should be following up with a survey. So Thank you to everyone who stuck with us, who joined us, and we hopefully will build the future of drones and solar together as we go forward. Thanks so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.